want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and try to give you something substantial on the JFK assassination rather than the usual gruel you find on YouTube and around the internet. Today, my guest is Larry Haapanen, who is an historian out west, who's been long involved with the JFK assassination. He's been involved with the military in investigating UFOs, and has got a long career on the history side, both JFK, the presidency, and the assassination. So welcome, Larry. And first question is, how did you get into the JFK assassination?
Well, I guess because it happened. And at that time, November 22nd, 1963, I was attending college at the University of Washington. I was a history major. And I also happened to be an ROTC cadet. So the day it happened, I was wearing my Army uniform, Army ROTC. I later shifted over to Air Force, but I happened to be home for lunch, and an older woman from down the hall knocked on the door and said she wanted to use our phone. And apparently she was having trouble with hers, and she said the president had been shot. And of course, I was dumbfounded. And so I watched the coverage on TV for a while. Then I went to back to class. Everything was canceled that afternoon. And of course, that whole weekend was kind of a bewildering, unreal kind of experience all the way through the shooting of Oswald and the funeral the following Monday in Washington. And so, as a history major, I kind of perked up my ears and was, paying maybe more attention than the average person to what seemed to be history in the making. In my teenage years, I was a kind of a Civil War buff, and that piqued an interest in the Lincoln assassination.
Right.
And I had a book by Otto Eisenschimmel that I picked up at a secondhand bookstore, and so I had a past interest in that. So the Kennedy assassination wasn't the first one I got interested in, but I waited, of course, eager to find out what the Warren Commission would decide.
Right.
Immediately after the report was made public, the networks, TV networks, had special programs on the Warren report. And so I audio taped, I think, ABC's special report on that. And for quite a long time then, afterwards, I was kind of, pretty content to let the Warren report be a accurate summation, of what had happened. I guess maybe I wasn't going as far as Gerald Ford when he said the Warren report would stand like a Gibraltar of factual literature through the ages to come. But nevertheless, during the years to come, I pretty much thought the Warren report had dealt with it adequately. But then in 1966, I made the dubious choice, I guess, that kind of changed my life in a way, of getting a copy of Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane right after it came out.
Right.
And that made me think that perhaps there was a conspiracy. And so then I started delving into the 26 volumes at the University Library when getting books by Weisberg, for example, and later Sylvia Marr and Joachim Yestin, Edward J. Epstein, of course, and looking, what articles that began to appear in magazines like Look and Ramparts and Saturday Evening Post and Minority of One and Esquire. Then, of course, in, I guess, February 1967, I was walking down a street in Los Angeles. I think I was there on a debate trip. And, there was a headline, Jim Garrison is investigating the assassination. So, of course, I began following the Garrison investigation, which I probably will touch on later. So that's how it happened.
So, yeah, Mark Lane was very, very influential. Did you start corresponding with some of these people back then?
No, I didn't. In 1967, I graduated and got my commission in the Air Force and went on active duty. From the money I got from my first paycheck, I ordered the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. I hadn't been able to afford the $76 before that. That doesn't sound like a lot today, but back then it would be like a whole month's rent. It was many hundreds of dollars in today's money. And so I began researching the 26 volumes on my own. And then in 1968, I joined up with a couple of other guys from Seattle, my hometown, in the Washington State Citizens Committee of Inquiry. Then I began to meet, know other people.
You knew George Renard?
From Seattle, and Paul Hoke, and Hal Verb, and Bill Turner in the Bay Area, and Fred Newcomb in Los Angeles, and through him, David Lifton and Ray Marcus I met, Leon Castellano, other people of that area.
And George Renard, right? You knew George?
Oh, yeah. George Renner was a lifetime friend of mine.
Right.
Yeah, I continued to know him for decades. He passed away in 2017. And I really lost a friend when he passed away.
Yeah, he has some of the more interesting letters and stuff that are out there. I don't know if there's anything more in his papers, but it was always interesting to read a George Rayner letter.
Well, yeah, he had a terrific sense of humor, as did Fred Newcomb, and their letters would sometimes, turn to satire and jokes. And George mailed Fred a dead cockroach on one occasion, and that was named Andy. And they had, in particular, a real humorous take on things at time.
What was your experience, just out of curiosity, with Raymond Marcus? Because I sort of gather from some of his letters, he seemed rather pedantic. But what was your experience with Raymond Marcus?
I met him once when he came over to Fred Newcomb's house, and I happened to be staying with Fred.
Okay.
Fred and Ray had a very contentious relationship, to put it mildly, because Fred loaned him a copy of the Zapruder film, and Ray wouldn't give it back, and you probably know about that.
Yeah, that's all related to the Farewell America story.
You bet. Yeah.
Okay, so look, tell how did you get involved with the Garrison investigation, and what did you do for Jim Garrison?
Well, yeah, the ironic part of it is I was a serving officer in the U.S. Air Force. Therefore, I had a kind of an arm's length relationship with the Garrison investigation. But what happened was Ed Jeffords, who was a reporter for the Tacoma News Tribune and chair of our committee in the Seattle-Tacoma area, he called me one day when I happened to be home in Seattle, because I would go there sometimes on weekends or on leave. And he said, "Hey, we're Southern cops," which of course wasn't technically true, but he was trying to joke around a little about it, because he had gotten these letters from Garrison's office appointing him and me as representatives of Garrison's office. This is in like September 68, several months before the Shaw trial.
Right.
And the office would send those letters out to literally God only knows who or how many. And I know I had one, Ed had one, Fred Newcomb had one, which I've seen. And, I'm sure others.
Do you still have yours?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, love to see that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have mixed emotions, because on the one hand, I thought there was some hope for the Garrison investigation. And then Fred and I turned out to be disillusioned about that after the Shaw trial. But at the same time, I felt like I was doing something.
Right.
The president had been shot down like a dog in the street, and there were what seemed to be good questions that had been raised about it. And the vast majority of Americans, may have thought that there was a conspiracy, but they weren't doing anything. They weren't lifting a finger
Right.
to look into it themselves. And so I didn't have any direct communication with Garrison's office. And that was, I think, the way I wanted it. But I did go through Steve Burton occasionally. He was the Citizens Committee of Inquiry chairman in Los Angeles,
Right.
a young college student at the time. Basically, I went out on my own, to kind of pursue a avenue of inquiry that nobody else was pursuing on Garrison's investigation, and that was looking into G. Clinton Wheat.
Mm.
Clinton Wheat is another fellow who was subpoenaed by Garrison, I think at the same time as Dr. Stanley Drennan.
Right.
In Los Angeles. And that came about because Lauren Skip Hall had told Garrison about these two guys, and he knew them both well. And, he talked to Garrison about how they had been leaders in the right-wing movement in the LA area. And Wheat had meetings in his home in Los Angeles where people like Colonel Gale of the California Rangers and Edgar Eugene Bradley and Hall and, other people.
Right.
Garrison was at least somewhat interested in. They were people that would go to these meetings, these so-called patriotic meetings at Wheat's house. And so Garrison wanted to talk to Wheat and Drennan. Drennan went to court and got a judge to turn down Garrison's request for Drennan to go testify on the grounds that Drennan said he had patients. As a physician, he had patients that depended on him for treatment, and he just couldn't tear himself away from LA.
Right.
And the judge went along with that. Wheat, on the other hand, just went on the lam. He just picked up, and it so happened that he had been living for several years just outside Klamath Falls, Oregon, which is where I was stationed at the Air Force at the time.
Huh.
So I was, Wheat and I had been in the same place.
Right.
So that put me kind of Johnny on the spot to look into Wheat. So Wheat was from Louisiana. He was a convicted murderer who had gotten a pardon. He was a heavy equipment operator by occupation and had moved to LA, owned a very large house, and set himself up as, kind of a leader of the far right there. In 1964, he chaired something called Committee of 1 Million Caucasians to March on Congress. They didn't actually have 1 million people show up. And he was also a guy who the FBI had an eye on. And he moved to LA, or from LA to Oregon.
Was he a Minuteman as well, or?
Well, I'd put him, it's hard to separate the groups in LA.
That's right.
The Minutemen, the California Rangers, the Christian Defense League, the NSRP.
Right.
They overlapped.
Yeah.
I think in their membership and in their certainly in their goals. So whether he was ever officially a Minuteman, I doubt. But he was part of that paramilitary right.
Right.
Milieu. Yes. So I set off to try to find out what happened to him. And I got in touch with reporters at the Reading Record Searchlight newspaper down in California, Reading, California. And they were covering this because Wheat had been traced to a cabin in a remote location in Shasta County, California. And they had actually interviewed his wife. But he had disappeared a second time. One day a car arrived, he piled in, and people drove him away, leaving his wife behind. And so I was able to, for example, listen to a taped interview with Mrs. Wheat. One reporter in particular, Wes Hughes, was very active in investigating Wheat and that and also other associated characters. So I kind of teamed up with Wes Hughes for a while. And I also got myself acquainted with Hal Hunt, who lived in Bernie, California. And he was the right-wing racist publisher of the National Chronicle, which had a rather wide readership, I think, in the far right. And he was an old fella who was sort of, I guess, hungry for some kind of company or someone to pay any attention to him. So I would occasionally drop by and talk with him at his office. And we got along pretty well, although, of course, I was totally out of step with his political beliefs. But he thought that I was kind of a fellow traveler with his cause, so, or else I wouldn't be there. So he would tell me things, and was, quite talkative, and so that was interesting. And then I talked to people in law enforcement. I really don't know why some of these. I talked to right wingers in Los Angeles about Wheat and his milieu. One lady in particular, her daughter, a teenager, had apparently run off with a fellow named Joseph Raymond Carey, who was originally from Texas and had been living in Southern California. And he was apparently a Minuteman. And Carey and this lady's daughter had disappeared. And she had written to all kinds of the local hard right paramilitary types in these different groups I previously mentioned. So she gave me a list of the people that she'd written to look at. And it was, kind of like a who's who of the more notorious characters.
Right.
Right wing in the LA area, whose names I ran across in print in various places or newspaper stories or so on. But I never found Wheat, despite my digging.
Do we know whatever happened to him?
Yes. He died in 1979 in Shasta County, California. In other words, he eventually came back to Shasta County with his wife in the 70s, I guess, and lived there until his death. And then he was buried back home in Louisiana.
Right.
Yeah, his wife told the story that she had heard from somebody who said they were an army man, and that she would go to Colorado Springs, she could see her husband again. And apparently he made some allusion to an army fort. I forget the name of it offhand. It was near Colorado Springs.
Right.
But she herself seemed to be kind of doubtful about where he had initially gone. Hal Hunt told me something interesting, though, because we were talking about Wheat, basically taking off for parts unknown after he was subpoenaed. And Hunt told me that if Wheat went to New Orleans and talked to the DA, the whole right wing would be finished. And I think that's kind of an exact quotation of what he said. I guess there was a fear that Wheat had such an inside knowledge of this far right wing of characters, it would not be a good idea for him to sit in front of a grand jury.
Yeah, I mean, I think of, Edgar Eugene Bradley, who was in the middle of that crowd. I mean, it appears that the only reason Garrison got interested in him was basically a feud between him and some of the other right-wingers.
Oh, you bet, yes. In August 1968, I went to Los Angeles, and a meeting was set up between me and the two major witnesses against Bradley. And I guess I can name them because I doubt they're alive, but Carol Adelot and
Right.
Tom Thornhill.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, names that a lot of people I think will recognize. And they told me all kinds of things, about how Bradley was this leader of a faction of the Minutemen that wanted Kennedy dead, not really a Depew faction, but a rival faction. And then I went down again in early 68 after the Shaw trial. And one night at Fred Newcomb's, I said, why don't we phone Bradley and see if we can talk to him? And Fred was a little dubious about that, but I got on the phone and I talked to Bradley and he said, come on over. So Fred and I went to Bradley's house and he met us at the door and said, don't you Garrison guys ever give up? Well, we assured him that we were not, strictly speaking, Garrison guys at that point. And then he proceeded to tell us the ins and outs of that feud,
Right.
And how there'd been an attempt to firebomb his house, and he had been more or less thrown out of his own church. Not that he was the preacher, but he was I guess, founder or leader of a church there in Los Angeles.
Right.
And, and how he had been feuding with people like Adelot and Thornhill. And yeah, you're right.
Yeah, well, there was even a lawsuit. They were suing each other as well. There was a big lawsuit going on.
Oh, I know. I went, and I'm thinking in 1971, I went to LA and attended one of the court sessions in that lawsuit.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Carol Adelot and Tom Thornhill were out in the hallway. I guess if they looked at me, they perhaps didn't recognize me for meeting me in 68. Right. Dennis Maurer was there with them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, of course, he was the young fella who had supposedly known about a Bradley plot to kill Kennedy in L.A. in 1960. Am I?
Right. I think, and that's when he was like 14 years old or something.
Yeah, 15, 14, right. But I didn't actually, I never met Maurer, but I did see him because he was there. And then I sat in the courtroom with Bradley or near Bradley. And that was, eventually he won the suit and was awarded $1. He suffered all kinds of personal difficulty. And, he was a reserve deputy sheriff. And when Hubert Humphrey visited LA in 1968, he was told, we don't want you in on any security arrangements concerning Humphrey's visit, because if something happened to Humphrey, and you were there, it would be, terrible. So that was one way it affected him. But of course, his reputation suffered. He talked about going in a store once, the proprietor, when they found out who he was, said, "Oh, you're the guy that killed Kennedy?"
Yeah.
He had to suffer through that. Now, in August 68, Fred Newcomb and I went to Edgar Eugene Bradley's house again, and we had a sit-down interview with Jerry Patrick Hemming and Lawrence Howard. And that, of course, Patrick Hemming dominated the conversation to the point where I don't remember anything that Howard had to say. But
right.
Jerry Patrick Hemming, of course, is well known as having been a teller of tall tales and a blabbermouth and somebody that you just really had to ask yourself what has he said that is true, or he told us, for example, that he met Oswald in L.A., or rather a suburb of L.A., in 1959.
Right.
Oswald was a Marine at El Toro, at the home of the Cuban Council in LA. I mean, he had very interesting stories, but that was kind of a unique. I thought it was kind of a unique place where we would end up interviewing Howard and Hemming at Edgar Eugene Bradley's house.
Fascinating. My favorite Hemming story is the year that he was on a panel at JFK Lancer, the conference in Dallas, and
Right.
he was so rambling and incoherent that everybody started laughing. And there's a write up on the web of that session where they just can't believe just like how this guy's completely incoherent, just making up these stories. It was quite a funny little write up.
Between 68 and 71, I met Bradley on several different visits to LA, and he was a very personable guy, seemingly, very sincere. And it was, I had a whole different take on him, of course, than the one I had when I first went to LA. And all I knew was Garrison had this guy arrested, and wow, I'm in the same city as Edgar Eugene Bradley. I didn't even know him. But what I did know him, of course, and he went on being associated with Fred Newcomb. I think Fred testified. I'm not sure about this, but I think Fred testified at his trial at the trial. When he sued for libel. He was going originally to sue other people.
Yeah.
As well. I think Mark Lane for
Mark Lane. I have a copy of like the 4-page suit against Mark Lane.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I assume it didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, I didn't meet Mark Lane until 71. But
well, I'm fascinated. I really feel for Bradley. When I point out to people that Garrison, he made him. He charged Bradley with conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy, and then oops, I made a mistake. It's quite a mistake to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Bradley told me once that he was visiting the Pacific Northwest and dropped in on Fred Chrisman after this was all over. It would have been, I think, between 68 and 70. And I guess I would have loved to have been there for that. I guess they had a chat, where they compared notes on what it's like to be a Garrison suspect.
So, this is all amazing material. So tell us a bit about Fred Chrisman and that part of your work for the Garrison investigation.
Yeah, well, I occasionally got asked to do something to look into Chrisman. We had kind of a division of labor in that up in the Seattle-Tacoma area, Ed Jeffords, who covered Chrisman as a reporter, for the Tacoma News Tribune. So Ed Jeffords and George Renner, my two comrades up there. I hope the word comrade doesn't get misinterpreted. In the committee, they did most of the investigating of Chrisman, and I did the wheat end of things, because by mere chance, I guess, we organized the committee of inquiry before either Wheat or Chrisman had actually been subpoenaed. They were not yet subpoenaed as witnesses by Garrison. So, and then it just so happens that Chrisman crops up in Ed and George's backyard, so to speak. And then a few months later, earlier, Wheat, who lived just outside the town where I lived in Oregon, got subpoenaed. So we were both kind of lucky to be so close to these characters. And so, but occasionally I would get asked to do something, or I would talk to people about Chrisman. Like I went to Vail, Oregon, where he went to high school, and I talked to a couple of people there who knew him. Another occasion, I was asked to look into some gypsy who was supposed to be tied up with Chrisman.
Right.
And this lived in Oregon. So I kind of got the Oregon end of the Chrisman um, detective work.
Yeah, and well, didn't he have a house in Oregon, or his wife, or his wife's father had a house in
Well,
Oregon?
his father, Fred Chrisman Sr.,
Right,
lived in Portland and had racehorses. He had as I understand it, a concession at the racetrack there. And yes, he does seem to have had a ranch or farm. Now that got made into a big deal. And that's what brought Fred up the coast from LA in July 68, after Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. Fred wanted to leave the country for a while. He just, couldn't put up with it. And he wanted to go to Canada, to Vancouver Island, and just get away from America and Americans for a while, which he did. But on the way up, he stopped and visited me in Klamath Falls, Oregon.
right.
Yeah, out of the blue, I got a knock on the door one day after I came home from the base, and here's Fred Newcomb with a beard, wearing sandals, and I was there in my Air Force uniform. So we kind of made a contrast, and
Right.
but we really, warmed up to each other very quickly, and we went out to dinner together. I took him out to the wheat place. After wheat disappeared for parts unknown, the house he'd been living in, an old schoolhouse, burned to the ground. And I would imagine he was the one that burned it.
Right.
But yeah, so I took the Newcombs out there and showed him that. So and then Fred kept going up the coast on the way to Vancouver Island and stopped to see George and Ed, and then on his way back, I was in Seattle, so we all had another little reunion then. But yeah, Fred was sent up north as kind of a side to his heading for Vancouver Island to look into Chrisman. And he did find a Chrisman farm in the rural part of Oregon west of Portland.
Well,
But
and
then,
I have to laugh because Garrison.
Beg pardon?
No, well, Garrison was the one who wrote a memo to the HSCA saying, look, isn't it strange? Shaw went to Portland after San Francisco after the assassination, and guess what? Chrisman has a farm, or his father has a farm out there. Isn't that strange?
Yeah, and one rumor had it that G. Clinton Wheat fled to that farm before he went back down to Shasta County, which I think is ridiculous.
Right, yeah.
And another version was that there were sadomasochistic parties or something that went on there. I mean, there were rumors going around about the Chrisman farm or the White farm, that never, of course, had any real basis. But yes, his father does seem to have had a farm.
And so Chrisman was involved in the sort of the Maury Island hoax.
Yeah, 1947.
Do you want to talk a bit about that? Or
You had recently, I know, as a guest, Adam Golightly,
yeah,
and he mentioned my name like 2 or 3 times. I've been trying to do some research that might be helpful to him. And Maury Island, of course, was this case where Fred Chrisman and another guy named Harold Dahl, supposedly reported these donut-shaped flying saucers going over Dahl's boat out in Puget Sound near Maury Island and dropping debris on the boat that killed the dog and injured Dahl's son. And then a couple of early UFO spotters, Kenneth Arnold and Emil Smith, came to Tacoma. Arnold had been hired by Ray Palmer, who was a publisher of amazing stories in Flying Saucer magazine and Fate magazine later.
right.
Palmer paid Arnold to go there to look into Maury Island, and Arnold recruited Smith to come with him. And then and they had discussions with Chrisman and Dahl. And then a couple of, at their behest, a couple of Air Force UFO investigators from Hamilton Air Force Base in California flew up in a B-25 and talked to Crispin and Dahl and supposedly got a hold of some of these fragments. And then the two officers, Davidson and Brown, in flying back, their B-25 crashed and they were killed. So that's kind of the whole thing in a nutshell. Of course, it was written off by the FBI and the Army Air Force as a hoax. It got a lot of newspaper publicity, particularly after the B-25 crash.
Yeah.
I think what I've asked myself, what makes Maury Island unique, if anything, in that early period where there were UFO sightings and other hoaxes going on all over the country, but particularly in the West Coast. And I guess what stands out is, number one, it had this dramatic element to it, this kind of sci-fi approach to what happened that none of the other UFO sightings had. They were all just visual sightings of shiny things or bright things in the sky. Here you had donut-shaped flying saucers that were dropping debris on people.
Right.
And, so it had this sci-fi element to it that nothing else had going. And also, secondly, oh, by the way, Chrisman was a big fan of sci-fi. I had somebody tell me that he should have been a science fiction writer. Somebody who knew him told me that, but he perhaps Maury Island was his way of, making some money if they could get their story published. And number two, allowing him to be kind of the sci-fi author in a way. The other thing, though, about Maury Island was the death of the two pilots or officers. That was just a terrible tragedy.
Yes.
And again, put a whole different cast on it. It made it a bigger, more. I guess as Ed Ruppel, the Project Blue Book chief, later called it. He said it was the second biggest hoax and the dirtiest hoax. that ever happened in UFOs. So the deaths just added to the sensationalism and the publicity and all that kind of thing that it got. So it stood out.
Yeah, it was tragic. I mean, it's hard to admit, it was a hoax after two people have been killed. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible thing.
Yeah, I met the nephew of one of the pilots or the officers, Philip Lipson and Charlotte Lefevre, who I've known for years. They wrote a book about Maury Island. And then they appeared, and I came along at a UFO festival south of Seattle a number of years ago. And two guests showed up. One was the nephew of one of the pilots, and the other was a lady who was Harold Dahl's daughter. But the pilot's nephew, he was just very broken up. And this is like, decades later. But he just seemed to be very broken up and emotionally affected by kind of, reminiscing about that whole event.
Yeah.
It was really tragic.
Yeah, very tragic. And so then Crispin went on, and he met Thomas Beckham, and they were sort of two characters who got involved in a variety of little schemes. I mean, at one point, Crispin even did a UFO conference, I think, at one point.
Oh, yeah. He went to one or two UFO conferences that I know of, yes. He continued occasionally to try to get some mileage out of the fact that he had been, there at the beginning, you might say. And he was touted, or at least by him or Harold Dahl, as being kind of like a character out of the Invaders television show, and that he was the most knowledgeable guy on UFOs around, and so on.
So what is the theory? What's the theory that about Chrisman and the JFK assassination? How does he supposedly fit into the assassination?
After Beckham was subpoenaed, I think in December, around the end of 1967, and he was subpoenaed because of his association in New Orleans in the early 60s, with the anti-Castro movement, and was supposed to be kind of a knowledgeable guy when it came to people like Bannister or Ferry or whatnot.
Jack Martin, too.
So he got subpoenaed. But also, there had been letters and contacts from people to Garrison's office saying, you ought to look into Beckham. Beckham, after it got subpoenaed, said, gosh, the only time I was ever in Dallas was with my manager. I was a country singer, still am. And my manager then was Fred Chrisman. And we did make a trip to Dallas, but that was 1966. So he publicly brought Chrisman's name up almost a year before Chrisman got subpoenaed. And somebody in Garrison's office made had noticed an anonymous letter that mentioned Chrisman and Beckham that had been written in, I think, May 67. So in February 68, Bill Boxley, who was an investigator for Garrison, sat down with Bob Lavender in San Francisco. And Lavender met Beckham in Omaha. And then not that long later, after Beckham had parted company with Chrisman in the Puget Sound area, Lavender shows up in Olympia, Seattle, Tacoma, that area, associated with Chrisman. And Lavender told Boxley, all kinds of things about Chrisman. There were, the anonymous letters, particularly the one from Florida, which I think was written in late 67. It, spelled all kinds of allegations about Chrisman, that he knew Clay Shaw, that he knew Tippett, which is really, I think, crazy. That he'd been in New Orleans dozens of times, and so on and so forth. All these things kind of piled up and eventually led to, and then Ed Jeffords, who would report on Chrisman in Tacoma. He was investigating and in touch with Garrison's office. And so eventually, in November 68, Chrisman got called as a witness, and he went down to New Orleans and testified and didn't have anything very valuable to say about anything. And, there are several things about Chrisman, though, that I think deserve to be brought up. One is he had a very brave and distinguished record as a Army Air Force pilot in World War II.
Right.
In the China-Burma-India theater. He did, I think, what looks to me like some good work on behalf of the Gypsies in Tacoma that really got quite a bit of notice and drew attention to the plight of Gypsy people, not just there, but across the country. It's kind of an underrepresented, ignored, left behind kind of segment of the population. So I think he did some good work on behalf of Gypsies. I personally don't consider that to have been a con job on Chrisman's part, as much as it was, a sincere attempt to help them. And then, of course, he had many years as a teacher and a school administrator. So he really did some positive, constructive things in his life. But he would also turn around and get involved in some dubious activities from time to time, some of which maybe he didn't even want to get involved in.
So tell us a bit about the fact Garrison included Chrisman in the first draft of his book
On the Trail of the Assassins.
Yeah, before that was published, he had Chrisman in there, and then so he had he had trouble getting it published, and I think he had contacted you and Fred Newcomb for some help in adding some information about Chrisman.
Yeah, I had continued to research Chrisman over the years. I met a fellow named Kalani Hanohano in Seattle in 1971 at a UFO study group. And after I got out of the Air Force, and Kalani had a strong interest in Chrisman. So Kalani and I collaborated for many years in researching Chrisman. In 1978, I was listening on radio to the broadcast on NPR, I think, of the House Select Committee hearings. And one day they bring up Chrisman, and their photographic panel had looked at those photos of the tramps,
Right.
and one of them could not be ruled out as Chrisman. They couldn't say definitely it was, but they couldn't. So I contacted the House Select Committee and ended up talking, because he called me back, I think, Cliff Fenton, the chief investigator for the House Select Committee. I told Fenton that when I taught high school in Oregon in the mid-70s, I met a woman who had been a teacher with Chrisman at Rainier High School. And I asked her, well, do you remember what went on and so on? And she told me about distinctly remembering Chrisman being in the high school the day of the assassination. And so I told Cliff Fenton about that. They ended up, as you know, I'm sure, getting affidavits, the teachers that had taught with him and could vouch for that. And of course, even in his book, Murder of a City, that came out in 1970, he said that's what he was doing. But that hadn't gotten much attention, or that had been pretty much overlooked. That book wasn't a bestseller. It wasn't widely read. So anyway, the House Select Committee's report ended up saying, we were able to exclude Chrisman, despite what the photographic panel said. He's clearly not one of the tramps.
Right.
So in the late 80s, Jim Garrison was working on his book on the trail of the assassins, and he contacted Fred Newcomb and asked him if he could help him out in any way with the Chrisman end of his research, which at that time, as you said, was going to be a big part of the book.
Yeah.
And by that time, he thought Chrisman was a CIA agent. And, Fred turned to me because he knew I had been doing research on Chrisman far beyond, what we did back in the 60s. So I wrote to Garrison, and I later had a phone call with him, where I said, basically, it'll do your book more harm than good to put Chrisman in it. Well, on the phone call, Garrison explained to me some of the reasons, we had for wanting to finger Chrisman, like the fact that Chrisman taught in a town in Oregon that wasn't too far from Dallas, Oregon, where Larry Crayford was from originally. And it was kind of like, yeah, but not even at the same time. So he gave me some very weak reasons. But one thing that you had a installment of your blog cover was something that I independently arrived at myself, and that was that Garrison thought Chrisman, because he'd worked at Boeing, represented this conglomeration of aerospace companies that was behind the assassination.
Right, yes.
In late 68, that was a big revelation for Garrison, that aerospace companies like General Dynamics or Lockheed or North American or Boeing in particular, that some group of those companies, and I don't mean to indict all of them. That was his bag. But, he really thought that was who was behind the assassination. And Chrisman was obviously still working for Boeing.
Yeah, in fact.
He had worked there from 60 to 62 in the personnel department. I talked to a woman who had worked in the personnel department back when Chrisman was there. And she told me that he had a pretty mundane job. And, it definitely didn't involve any cloak and dagger kind of stuff that Garrison ascribed to it.
Well, I spoke to the publisher, I think, of Prentice Hall, one of the companies that turned down Garrison's book. And I spoke to him, and he basically said one of the problems was that Garrison had promised all this information about Chrisman and the CIA, and nothing materialized. And that was one of his chief reasons for turning down the book.
Yeah, I found on the internet, and you may have done so as well, the actual letter from the editor or publisher,
Yeah,
explaining that to Garrison. Yeah, that you just have the material you have on Chrisman is just too weak. So it turned out, back when I talked to Garrison, of course, I had no idea that that was happening. So it turns out my call to Garrison wasn't the only or even an important reason why he dropped Chrisman from the book, but maybe it had a little bit to do with it. I don't know.
well, I'm sure it had a lot to do with it, but perhaps what I don't know is did Sklar, who was the editor of his book, did he also help or tell Garrison to take out Chrisman?
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the Sklar papers are locked up in the AARC, and I'm just trying to get to look at those papers, which might tell us more about the editing of Garrison's book.
You bet. Well, there's so much we know, and even so much more that we don't know and would like to, and it's a shame that we don't have access. But of course, it would take 100 people a lifetime of work to go through a lot of what's out there that we unfortunately don't have the time to look at or have access to.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the AARC does digitize a lot of their stuff, because they have an awful lot of interesting material that's just sort of sitting there they have like 5 different warehouses in the DC area. So I wish they would digitize it.
Well, right. Or as another example of what's sitting around somewhere, I hope, is the 40 filing cabinets and stuff that David Lifton accumulated. Because I don't think everything in it would be garbage.
No, I'm sure he had a lot of Garrison material, and he had all sorts of stuff, letters from other researchers, and
and the results of interviews that he did.
Yeah,
some of which he never mentioned in print.
Yeah, no, I mean that stuff is somewhere, and I wish somebody would digitize it. I can tell you that somebody is now digitizing Gaetan Fonzie's records, which is
good. I have like a banker's box full of correspondence with Lifton.
Okay.
He was, I only met him once in my life, but 25 years ago or so, I became in close contact with him again, and for years, he would share. And I was, not always convinced by what he was sharing, but I enjoyed knowing him. I enjoyed knowing Lifton.
Yeah, I had one phone call with David Lifton, and I had called him in Las Vegas. I wanted to talk about the question whether General LeMay was at the autopsy. Right. And it was it was a fun conversation with David. In his apartment, there was only one small space where he got good cell reception. And so if he moved slightly, he would lose connection. At one point, we did lose connection, and he immediately sent me an email, "Call me right back." And I called him back, and we spent over an hour on the phone. He was reminiscing about, the different publishing companies that took on Best Evidence, and it was a bit of a reminiscing time for him. I think, he appeared to me maybe a bit lonely, or wanted somebody to talk to.
Yeah, I had a lot of long conversations with him, or conversations that would come at pretty late at night for me. And it was always enjoyable to talk to him. And he would reminisce quite a lot.
So just, we don't have that much time left, but can you tell us a bit about your work in the military on investigating UFOs?
Sure. Yeah, I was stationed at Kingsley Field, an Air Force base in Klamath Falls, Oregon, for 3 years. And it wasn't long after I got there that they decided that I ought to be, as a brand new second lieutenant with not enough work, I guess, to do, that in addition to my job as base disaster preparedness officer, that was my main duty there for 3 years, they would make me the UFO project officer for the base.
Right.
And that meant that I would investigate in the field UFO reports that arrived from people generally in the Southern Oregon, Northern California area, because we were very close to the California border. We were kind of what I thought of as the greater Mount Shasta area,
Right.
in a manner of speaking. So, and a few months went by before I got my first report to look into. But over a period of time, from 68 on, and of course, this was for Project Blue Book, so I would send reports to them and also to the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado, which was investigating UFOs under an Air Force contract. And some cases I investigated, I didn't report because they just didn't seem to have anything to go by. You know, like somebody saw a little light in the sky going over at night, which could be anything.
Right.
So I would talk to them, and then I would, and take the written report. They'd fill out a form. And, then I would decide not to send it into Project Blue Book because they wanted something that was more, had some substance.
Right.
So every few months, on average, I would get a report. And I think maybe twice I sent in a report in writing, or by fax to Project Blue Book and the Condon Committee. And then after the Project Blue Book was shut down in December 69, a few months went by, and in April 70, I got another report. At that point, I decided, well, I may not be working for Project Blue Book anymore, but I'll go investigate it anyway. It was a report by a couple of Air Force sergeants of what they thought was the landing of a UFO on a mountain in Northern California. That turned out to be very interesting. They were good witnesses. They showed me a picture that they made of the UFO that looked very interesting.
Right.
It looked a lot like a picture I'd seen of a UFO in France. And I had a Geiger counter with me and a Polaroid camera. And when I took a photograph of what they said was where the UFO landed, with a Polaroid camera, you'd pull the thing out and then you could watch it develop, as you may remember.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this photograph visualized in front of my eyes. And what I'm looking at is the sergeant off in the distance, trees and logs, and then what looked like flames of fire coming out of the ground. I thought, now that may have been an anomaly of the film. I totally recognize that in retrospect. But you can imagine my reaction looking at this photo and seeing what I couldn't see with the naked eye that looked like fire coming up.
Right.
From the ground. But so that turned out to be very interesting, but I had nobody to report it to. Project Blue Book didn't exist anymore. So I just put it in my file, which I still have. I still have my file of all my reports and notes and photos and things like that. Because otherwise it would have gotten thrown away.
Right.
Project Blue Book ended.
So what do you make of the current activity with UAPs that's going on right now? I don't know really what to make of it. It's kind of bewildering. I've never been much of a believer in the actual existence of some kind of alien hardware flying around in our skies. So even though I have an interest in flying saucers that goes back to my really back to my childhood, I was a regular reader of Fate magazine as a teenager, and I bought books about UFOs back when I was maybe 10 or 12. Right.
And
as did I.
Yeah. So I had this long history of interest in UFOs, but when I actually started investigating them, I found that the witnesses were very reputable, credible people. But the difficulty is, how do I, as the investigator, establish what it was they saw, or even really for sure what it looked like or how it behaved.
Right.
So they would draw me diagrams and give me a description. But then, it was a case of, do I really think this is truly unidentified? I've got some statistics here. The 2 years, 1968 and 1969, 68, there was only, Project Blue Book only categorized 3 sightings that whole year as unidentified. And then in 69, only 1. So I came in at a point where Project Blue Book was treating very, very few UFO sightings as being truly unidentified. For what reason?
Well, I'm just amazed that like Luna has her hearings in Washington, and then she actually was on Joe Rogan's show claiming that our advanced technology today is because of aliens. I mean, it's I couldn't believe she actually said that, and
well, I can believe she said it, but
yeah.
I can't believe it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, well,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, well, yeah, go on to another topic if you have time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd like to do is just sort of, there's so much more to talk about. I mean, I'd just like to get your thoughts on the current state of JFK assassination research, what you think about the assassination today, and how that's changed over the years. I mean, it's just a generally broad topic.
Well, I think I've grown more skeptical over the years, about many of the claims that are made, the conspiracy theories and so on. I've decided now that I've got to a certain point in life that I would like to be neutral on the subject of the JFK assassination. I know that's a way of probably alienating everybody else who has any interest in the subject, but I'd kind of like to take the stance that I'm neither pro-conspiracy theory nor totally anti-conspiracy theory, because I think there is some possibility, kind of thinking from an epistemological viewpoint, that we don't know quite enough to be able to say flatly that there was no conspiracy of any kind. Oswald might have conspired with the groundkeeper at Dealey Plaza, so that guy would make his lawnmower backfire and be a distraction as Oswald fired the shots. I'm not saying that happened. Please don't get that. I'm saying that would be, but that kind of conspiracy, of course, would thrill no one. No one would knock themselves out for decades trying to prove that kind of conspiracy. It just wouldn't rise to the level of what would make people who believe in a conspiracy happy.
Right, yeah.
But at the same time, some kind of low-level conspiracy that doesn't have to include everyone and their brother, or every letter agency of the government, you can't totally 100% with 100, moral conviction rule that out. And I don't imagine what I'm saying is going to make some people happy. But on the other hand, the conspiracy theories that have come along, the thing is to look at them each in turn and see what's wrong with them. And there's always something wrong. Or there's always something lacking or something more than I'd like to see before I would buy into them. So individual conspiracy theories, I have yet to be convinced. But, I think debunkers, if you want to use that term, it's really kind of an unpleasant term in a way, like UFO debunkers. But, the people that the conspiracy theorists would despise as being debunkers are really doing the conspiracy theories a service as, being critics of what they do. It's setting up guardrails. It's saying, look, if you want to have a decent conspiracy theory, don't do this or don't bring up that.
Right.
But, kind of narrow your thinking and try to weed out the garbage and the untruths and the mistakes that you're making, and then see what you have left and maybe build on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. I'm surprised that more conspiracy believers don't do some of that work. Policing themselves. It's very important. The other thing I would say about a possible conspiracy is I think the one thing that I don't know about is, was somebody egging Oswald on that we don't know about in Dallas?
Jim Hosty thought so. You know, Jim Hosty, who I got to know back in 1983 when he came and talked to my JFK assassination class in Kansas. He came on 2 different occasions and spoke at length both times. I also met him once at his home, and we talked on the phone and corresponded for years after that. You know, he talked about the Castro regime murder mountain. That's the way he put it. That he thought that perhaps not with intent, as far as Oswald was concerned, not that they were particularly addressing him, but, you know, he was just influenced by and egged on, in a way, by the rhetoric that was coming out of Havana. Now, I think eventually Hosty went a little bit further than that, because in his book, Assignment Oswald, you know, he says he makes an assertion that I think has gotten very little, if any, attention. He asserts in Assignment Oswald that Oswald was photographed in Mexico City on a street with Kostikov. I think by the time he wrote Assignment Oswald, which was like around 10 years after I met him, he brought that up, which he had never mentioned to me. But, you know, so I think Hosty over time became a conspiracy theorist, but thought that it was the Cuban and or the Russian governments that were behind it.
Right.
More than just Oswald picking up something from the news that Castro may have said.
Yeah. No,
that Castro did it theory was also bought into by other people, like, you know, 2 men that in '63 were very much involved in Cuban affairs in the Department of the Army were Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano. And they both expressed over the years their conviction that Castro was behind the assassination. And I don't know that we can totally rule that out. But
yeah,
again,
there's also Gus Russo's theory about...
well, yes, Gus Russo, you bet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I guess we normally think of him as being anti-conspiracy, but on the other hand, he certainly did some intriguing research on the Castro angle.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, look, I think there's a lot more we can talk about in this. We'll probably have to do another interview at another time, but thank you very much for a great session. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.